Well, this is a great biblical story, this story of the healing of the man born blind. It actually does go on for all of chapter 9 in John's Gospel, and I encourage you to read it sometime. We read the whole thing in the first service, and it took 9 minutes. So I thought, in deference to your need to have lunch, I would let you read that on your own, because I'm truly preaching today from the 1 Corinthians passage. But the John passage is also important, because to John, this is a story much more than a simple healing of a blind man. It goes on to have the Pharisees attack Jesus repeatedly, and their blindness is really the subject of the story. For to John, the Pharisees' blindness to the reality of who Jesus was very important. But for us today, I think this story is very important because it helps us to see Jesus in the light of John's gospel. You remember maybe that Jesus is described in the first chapter of John as God incarnate, as God made flesh. Verse 18 of chapter 1 of John says, "No one has ever seen God. It is God, the only Son, who is close to the Father's heart, who has made him known." In John's gospel, Jesus is the light of the world because he is the light that shines upon God's true character and illumines for us who God is. Jesus shows what God is really like through his words and his actions. Now, the Gospel of John is quite different from the other three Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, which we like to call the synoptics, which is the Greek word meaning seen together. Because as we see the other three Gospels together, we see many similarities. But John is different. One difference is that in the calling of the disciples, he doesn't go to the Sea of Galilee and call them all at once. Instead, he gets them one at a time. They respond individually to Jesus' invitation to come and see. Seeing is very important in John. For each new disciple's view of Jesus is different, kind of the way our view of Jesus, each of us, is a little different. Each of us sees Jesus from a slightly different perspective and through the lens of our own unique life experience. And some people, like the Pharisees here in chapter 9 of John's Gospel, some people are too blind to ever see Jesus at all. I know our faith journey groups have been struck in this past week of how differently we each see Jesus because he was the topic of our class. I had printed out 60 different images of Jesus from the internet and taped them up on the walls of the library, the church library over there where our class meets. And you can look at them yourselves if you want to after the service, if you're curious. They're all from different ages of art history and from different cultures, from different kinds of artists. And yet each of them represents a unique way that someone saw Jesus. And each of those images struck the members of our group differently. I asked people to pick pictures that appeal to them and also pick pictures that were to them troubling or at least less appealing. And it was amazing how one image that really attracted one person just did not ring true to another. And yet, here we are, all gathered here as the body of Christ in the Congregational Church of Brookfield. How is it possible for us to each see Jesus differently and still get along and still worship? Without a common vision, how can we truly unite ourselves in ministry and mission? Well, that's the motivation in a way for me launching this new visioning process, which is continuing at tomorrow night's program board meeting. I know we're Congregationalists, we'll never agree on everything, but maybe we can claim a vision that can inspire us and unite us so that we can do ministry a little bit better together. And I'm suggesting today that we might start with communion. That's why I chose today's text from 1 Corinthians, where Paul not only reminds us of the familiar words of institution that are spoken at each communion, I think it also provides a common vision for Jesus and for the church. I think it holds some important clues for us today about where we can actually see Jesus in our lives. It shows us how we can relate to him better and to one another in the church. And I would argue that we really do need to see Jesus as clearly as possible, since we acknowledge him in our tradition as the only true head of the church. Seeing Jesus better really must be at the start of any visioning process. So what does Paul here have to say in the letter that he wrote to the Corinthians that might be of help? Well, I want to begin by reminding you that Paul had been a Pharisee. And like the Pharisees in John's 9th chapter, he had been completely blind to the truth of Jesus when Jesus was walking as a man in the streets of Jerusalem. It was only when Paul was literally struck blind on the road to Damascus that he somehow saw the true vision of the risen Christ for the first time. Paul's conversion filled him with passion for the gospel, and he began planting new churches all throughout the known world at that time, including Corinth in Greece. Most pastors like me have great sympathy for the Apostle Paul because, like Paul, most of us can recall times when we tried our best to teach something, only to find out later that either we didn't say what we meant to say or we were a little bit misunderstood. And that's what was happening